Okay, good morning, everyone. As per the usual, I've muted you all, but please feel free to unmute yourselves if you want to raise any points, ask any questions, or to use the chat facility to so do. Sorry, just trying to get my computer working properly here. Okay, so following on from looking at Olam Haba and the world to come and Chias HaMesim and that topic, a lot of questions were raised around the Ikrim, the fundamentals of belief, and their role in Olam Haba and the place of non-believers in the world to come and of non-Jews in the world to come. Now, in truth, in this series, in a sense, we've been looking at some of the fundamentals of faith because belief in Chias HaMesim and belief in the world to come are themselves fundamentals of faith, but they are fundamentals along with many others. So included in the Ikrim Emunah, if we just think about the Yud Gimel Ikrim, the 13 principles of faith, they start off with belief in Hashem, that he exists, that he brings all existence into being, that he is has unity, absolute unity, no body, that it's only appropriate to pray to him. And then they moved on to prophecy, that the words of the Nevi'im of the prophets are true, belief in the prophecy of Moshe, belief in Torah, and then they move on to a third class, which is that effectively of reward and punishment, the world to come, Moshiach and Chias HaMesim, the revival of the dead. And the start of the conversation as to the place of those who don't believe in the Yud Gimel Ikrim and their place in the world to come, of course, starts off with the Rambam. The Rambam was the one who first introduced this concept of 13 principles of faith. There are other lists of principles or ideas that we Jews have to believe in, including some that preceded the Rambam, such as Rav Sadi Gaon. But until the Rambam, no one sort of dedicated a significant piece of writing to systemically listing the Yud Gimel Ikrim, listing the 13 principles of listing principles of faith at all, and in the Rambam's count, listing 13 principles of faith. Now, where does he list them, and what does he have to say about them? So, in his the most famous formulation of the Yud Gimel Ikrim, or the two most famous formulations of the 13 principles of faith that are familiar to us, are both from the Siddur. Things that appear in the Siddur, of course, become more well known than things that are written in halachic or other forms of works. And the 13 principles of faith appear or have become added onto the Siddur in two locations. Once, often said at the beginning of davening, which is Yigdal. Yigdal is a 13-line poem, which is a very brief exposition or summary of the 13 principles of faith, written in poetical form. And the other place where they appear is at the end of daily davening, where they are printed in the Siddur, and many have the practice of saying Ani Mamin B'Emunah Shlema, etc., 13 times. Some of these texts have become very famous as songs. So Ani Mamin B'Emunah Shlema B'Vias HaMashiach, etc., has been put to numerous tunes and has become very popular songs. There were songs that were composed in pre-war. There were songs that were composed during the Holocaust. For some reason, that's become the symbol of the idea of belief in not for some reason, for obvious reasons, in belief in salvation and the world becoming a better place. And therefore, this has become very popular and well known as a song. But neither of these lists of the 13 principles of faith were actually reported or actually edited, created by the Rambam. Both were written significantly later. Yigdal was written several hundred years after the Rambam, initially spread through the Ashkenazi world, interestingly, and then later, much later, spread to from Italy to the Ashkenazi world, later spread to the Sephardi world. Similarly, the Ani Mamins started off in Italy and spread through the Ashkenazi world and then onto the Sephardi world. So these are not written by the Rambam, they are summaries of the view of the Rambam, and in neither case are they exactly accurate representatives of what the Rambam had to say, which by definition would be the case because the Rambam spent quite a length writing these pieces, And these are summaries, and all summaries include some things and cut out other things. And therefore, by definition, the authors of the summary had to make decisions about what to include and what to exclude, and in so doing can slightly alter the meaning of the Yud Gimel Ikrim. But either way, they are more or less summaries of the 13 principles that the Rambam wrote about. Now, in a few moments, we'll look at where the Rambam himself wrote it, but post the Rambam, and indeed even during the life of the Rambam, there was some controversy around the 13 principles of faith. And these controversies took two forms. One form of controversy was over the whole concept of principles of faith. In other words, who says there is such an idea as an Ikra Emunah, as a principle of faith? And you can take one of two extremes to disagree with the idea of an Ikra Emunah, with a fundamental of faith. Disagreement number one could be who says that there's such a thing as an Ikra Emunah. It's not clear that really Jews have to believe anything at all. The Torah is full of mitzvahs. Most of the mitzvahs don't instruct belief. Most of the mitzvahs don't instruct Emunah or faith. Most of them are about actions or emotions or speech. There are things we should say and things we shouldn't say. There's things we should do and shouldn't do. Things we should feel and shouldn't feel. So love, yes. Jealousy, not. Actions, build a sukkah, don't murder. Things we should and shouldn't do in the world of action. And finally, in the world of speech, there are things we should say and shouldn't say. Don't say Lashon Hara, do say Kriya Shema, and so on and so forth. Who says that there's a system of belief at all? So this is one critique of the Rambam, voiced by, particularly by the Abarbanel and others. By the way, this isn't a machlokas that particularly divides neatly into the line of rationalists or philosophical Rishonim versus the Kabbalists. Abarbanel certainly would group himself amongst the more philosophically inclined early authorities Rishonim. But nonetheless, he doesn't like the concept of Ikra Emunah. And the alternative way of voicing the criticism is who says there's 13 principles of faith? 13 principles of faith? Surely there's 613 mitzvahs, and a Jew has to believe in all of them. So who is it that decides that there's principles of faith? So the critique can go two ways. One can be who says that belief is at all an important part of the system. Surely it's about action and deed. And the other one would be who says it's good enough to just believe in the 13 principles of faith? Surely if you deny any of the Ikrim, you have the same, any of the mitzvahs, you have the same problem there. I mean, a Jew who says, I believe the whole Torah other than Shabbos, or I believe in the whole Torah other than Kashrus, they don't seem to be directly contravening any of the 13 principles of faith. They believe in Mashiach, they believe in Nevuah, they believe in Moshe Rabbeinu. So what exactly is the idea of the 13 principles of faith? And one could argue that actually, if one looks in principle number 8, the Rambam seems to say that all the Torah that we possess is that was given to Moshe, in which case, effectively, the Rambam says that the whole of the 613 mitzvahs, the whole of the Torah, is one of the principles of faith, in which case that one makes all the rest of the list irrelevant. Because if you believe that the whole Torah as we have it is the Torah that was given to Moshe, then what else is there to talk about? Every mitzvah which is listed in the Torah surely is included in the 13 principles of faith. So this was critique number one of the Rambam, the whole concept of Yud Gimel Ikrim of 13 principles of faith. What does that mean? In what way are there 13 principles of faith? There are either no principles of faith, or and the whole Torah is one big principle of faith. More than that, well, some of them seem to fit easily into predetermined mitzvahs in the Torah according to the understanding of the Rambam. Others don't seem to be mitzvahs at all. So I think we can all get that belief in Hashem is a mitzvah. The Rambam lists it as a mitzvah, Nochi Hashem Elokech, the first of the 10 Commandments. That itself is a discussion. Is it the first of the 10 Commandments, is it, or isn't it? But where exactly does it say in the Torah that you have to believe in Mashiach, or you have to believe in Tchias HaMesim? Again, I understand these are important beliefs, but there's no pasuk anywhere that says, thou shalt believe in this. So again, in what way is this an Ikra Emunah? What way did the Rambam choose this as one of the 13 principles of faith? So this is one set of criticism of the Rambam. Exactly how does the concept of Ikra Emunah, how does the concept of Ikra Emunah tie into the concept of the 613 commandments, which the Rambam himself wrote about in his Book of Commandments, his Sefer HaMitzvahs. Critique number 2 of the Rambam is more detailed. In other words, I accept the concepts of principles of faith, but I'm going to quibble over one here or one there. And again, there's a mountain of literature around that point. So, for example, the Rambam included in his Ikrim in the third one that Hashem has no body. Now, this is quite an abstract philosophical idea. Someone can be a perfectly good Jew, seemingly, loyal to Hashem, accepting his role as the creator of the world, as the all-knowing God, as the one who commanded us what to do, absolutely determined to do all our 613 mitzvahs. And yet they think Hashem has a body. They picture Hashem as being very big and very large and all-powerful. They're not particularly philosophically inclined if that's what they picture. But in what way is this person a heretic? I mean, this is a terrible claim to make about someone. Just because they think that Hashem has a body that makes them into a heretic, it makes them into a poor and shoddy philosopher. But so what? I mean, who says a Jew has to be a philosopher? A Jew has to be a righteous person, a pious person, someone who does good deeds, someone who does mitzvahs, someone who does chesed, someone who keeps what the Torah says. Okay, and even if the Rambam, I accept the Rambam says it includes certain beliefs, but where does philosophical beliefs, like Hashem does have a body, doesn't have a body, why is this important? So you could have criticisms of particular ones of the 13 principles of faith. You may even agree that they're true and they're correct, but you still may not think that they're principles of faith. And the Raavad famously critiques principle number 3, that's why I started with that. The Raavad, Rabbi Ram ben David, who was a contemporary of the Rambam, lived in the same lifetime as the Rambam. He lived in the zone that we've spoken about before many times, in the south of France, the interface between Spain and the Muslim world, who are Arabic speaking, who get to know the Rambam, who are really part of one Arabic speaking culture, and get to know the Rambam through his Arabic writings, and Ashkenaz and France and Germany, who really only begin taking in the Rambam, an interest in the Rambam maybe 100 years later. He lives in the south of France, the Montpellier region, in which we've discussed before, in which the works of the Rambam are very quickly translated. There are many many Jewish Spanish refugees who run away there, who are Arabic speaking, who translate the works of the Rambam. The Raavad already in the lifetime of the Rambam realizes the Rambam's big, the Rambam's massive, he's significant. And the Raavad, who is a very significant figure in his own right, writes critiques of the Rambam. The Raavad has gone down in history. He's known as the Baal HaSagot, the master of criticism, the critic par excellence, Baal HaSagas. And that's because the Raavad wrote critical notes to the Rambam. He wrote critical notes to the Rif and various other great figures. And he's become most famous for his critical notes, which are learned and scholarly and very, very important. The truth is, though, he wrote his own works also. He wrote his own Sorim, but he became more famous for his criticism of others. And the Raavad already picks on critique number 3, and he says there are many great figures. Famously, he says, Rabbi Matovim Imenu, greater and better than the Rambam himself, who believed that God had a body. What led them to this belief? Because they saw the Medrashim that anthropomorphalize Hashem, and even the language of the Psukim themselves. The Psukim talk about the outstretched arm of God, Zroya Natuya, the Yad Chazak, the strong hands of God. If you read the Psukim, you read the Medrashim at face value, it looks like Hashem does have a body. The Rambam doesn't think this is correct. The Raavad doesn't think this is correct. He's not disagreeing with the Rambam about the mistake. He agrees that this is a mistake. Of course God doesn't have a body, says the Raavad. However, he says there are many great figures that didn't know this. There are many figures greater than the Rambam that didn't know this. They learnt the Medrashim and the Psukim, literally, and they understood that God has a body. Are we going to say these are heretics, chas v'sholom, these great figures? Are we going to say they're non-believers? What's a terrible thing to say about these great figures? A lot of ink has been spilt about who exactly these great figures are. Who are these people who the Raavad calls greater than the Rambam, who believes in God having some form of body? Be that as it may, this is the claim that the Raavad makes. And the Raavad says this shouldn't be a fundamental of faith. It's not that I disagree with the idea, but I don't think it should be listed as a fundamental of faith. So this is a second sort of criticism. I agree with the concept of a fundamental of faith, but I tweak them. I don't think that something the Rambam listed should be included. By the way, in reading non-voweled texts, it's always important to make sure one's voweled the words correctly. The Raavad said that the believers in ascribing some sort of physical form to the Rambam are Rabbi Matovim Mimenu or Mimenoi. It's traditionally read as Mimenoi. Rabbi Matovim, they are greater and more than him, greater and more than the Rambam himself. The alternative way to read it is just to change a vowel. Rabbi Matovim Mimenu, they're greater and more than us, in which case the Rambam isn't being, the Ravid isn't saying that they were greater than the Rambam, he's saying they're greater than us. It's a more modest critique. But either way, the Ravid thinks there were great people who believed in God having some form of physical body. And he says they're great people. He's not agreeing with them, but he says what would make them into heretics. This is one sort of, second sort of tweak or criticism of the Rambam. Other ones in the list of the Rambam that have had particular attention paid to them, the Rambam says one is only allowed to pay to God. The Rambam thinks that praying to angels or praying to other human beings is heresy. And we're aware from the text of our tefillah that praying to angels, for example, is not an uncommon feature of tefillah, of prayer. Certainly there are many Kabbalistic prayers and even non-Kabbalistic prayers in which we appear to pray to angels. And again, those who argue with the Rambam say he may be correct that it's wrong to pray to angels. Maybe it's appropriate. Maybe you can pray to angels, but this isn't heresy. What does it mean to pray to angels? It doesn't mean, God forbid, that one's denying the all-powerful nature of God. One's simply saying, I'm praying to an angel, and the angel will is the shliach, the messenger of God. That's what it means, the agents of God. That's the very meaning of the word angel. A malach is an agent, is a shliach. I'm simply the agents of God, and therefore I'm praying to God as the agents of God. So exactly what's wrong with praying to angels? It's not a disbelief. It's not a heresy. Maybe it doesn't make sense. Maybe it does make sense. But why would this be a heresy? And we're aware that this is a feature of tefillah. I mean, the most famous prayer which appears to address angels is Yaakov Avinu's prayer, Hamalach Hagol Osi Mikolah Yavorich Es Hanorim. He seems to be saying the angel who protected me from evil, he should bless the lads. So Yaakov seems to pray to an angel. And certainly there's a commonality of tefillah. Every Friday night we sing Shalom Aleichem Malachei Hasharis. We sing to the angels, Malachei Hasharis, the ministering angels. We welcome them into our homes. And then we say, Baruch Chuni L'Shalom. You should bless us. Seemingly we're speaking to the angels and asking that they should bless us. In Birchas Kohen, in which we learnt about in this week's Sedra, we seem to have tefillos in Selichos. There's the famous prayer of Machnisei Rachamim, Machnisei Rachamenu. We ask the angels who are responsible for bringing in requests of prayers, we ask them to bring our prayers in, and it doesn't seem so obvious that it's impossible to pray to angels. Again, so a quibble over a particular one of the Ikrim. And then there are questions about the parameters of the articles of faith. Exactly how far do they go? So, for example, the Rambam says we have to believe in Ikka 7, which I mentioned already. He says we have to believe the whole Torah is true. What exactly are the parameters of this principle of faith? What does it mean to say when we say the whole Torah is true? Do we mean the whole of the written Torah, or do we also mean the oral Torah? The Rambam says explicitly the oral Torah. What level of the oral Torah? Every single detail of the oral Torah? Well, surely the oral Torah is full of arguments. Different opinions say different things in the oral Torah. You just open a Mishnah and you open a Shulchan Aruch, you see there's a variety of different views. Exactly what level, how far would this stretch? So again, there's a whole realm of discussion around the principles of faith of the Rambam, and this led to later works being written which fine-tuned or tweaked or argued completely with the Rambam's list. In other words, they're part of a different sort of criticism. They agree with the concept of fundamentals of faith, but they disagree with the list of 13 and think they should be listed differently. And amongst these are Sefer Ikrim, the works of Alba and others who agree with the concept of principles of faith, but disagree with the particular ones amongst the list. So this is a sort of sweeping summary of the history of principles of faith. Some mention of the idea pre the Rambam, but no systematic listing other than a Sadigan, who really mentions it as an aside, as a pshat in the pasuk in his commentary on the Torah, not really a dedicated sort of work or mini work to the subject, as opposed to the Rambam. The Rambam is the first extensive treatment of the subject, who lists 13 principles of faith, 2 attacks on the Rambam. One is the whole concept of principles of faith. Maybe there should be no principles of faith. Judaism's about ideas and about doing and action and feelings and words. Or maybe everything in the Torah is a principle of faith. Criticism number 1. The whole concept of principles of faith. Criticism number 2. Even if you accept the concept of there being a discrete list of principles of faith, criticism around the idea of exactly how the Rambam found these 13, and maybe you can tweak some of them a little bit here or a little bit there, or indeed come up with your own list. So this is a history of the 13 principles of faith. And as I said, a lot has been written around around the subject, and you can a lot of it is now available in English. In previous years, it was only available in Hebrew, but in recent years, a lot of works have come out around this in English also, and the literature is there in the library. I'm not really going to say that much more about this particular angle of attack. What I want to do, though, is look at what the Rambam himself said, and what has become the predominant view in Judaism, because it's inarguable that the concept of a principle of faith has become fairly embedded in our consciousness. It's made it into the Siddur. Once something makes it into the Siddur, it becomes a daily part of the fabric of life. Now, not everyone says the Yud Gimel Ikrim. I personally, we don't have this practice to saying the 13 principles of faith after davening. However, I come from a Yekish background where we certainly used to sing Yigdal. So in some shape or form, it's entered into the Siddur of a lot of ours, whether as the summary of the 13 principles of faith or whether as Yigdal. So there's no doubt that the Rambam has proven, as in so many other things, to have been massively influential. And even if it's true and possible to point out that there are tweaks here and there where the Rambam's view isn't exactly and perfectly held by everyone, nonetheless, broadly speaking, the Rambam's take on this this matter has become the dominant one, and therefore it makes sense to focus on what he has to say about it, even though we'll see what fine-tuning it there is. And it's interesting when you learn through the more recent academic works that have been published around the Yud Gimel Ikrim, most of them are at the end of the day, all said and done, fairly minor tweaks here and there in the Rambam. They're not massive tweaks in the Rambam. And the figures, many of the figures who disagree more significantly with the Rambam and do make significant, big tweaks to the 13 principles of faith, are from fairly unknown figures in Jewish history. They're figures that most of the time we haven't heard of until they're drawn to our attention by the authors of these books. Incredibly important books. Some of them have been written by personal friends of mine and so on. This is not a criticism of the works. I think these are fantastic works. But at the end of the day, the broad structure of the Yud Gimel Ikrim has remained that which most Jews would see as our articles of faith. So it's important for us to try and understand exactly what the Rambam meant by them, and to what degree a non-believer would have no place in the world to come. Now, I'm aware that this is not just a matter of academic interest. This is something that affects us all in some shape or other. We may all have very close family and friends who don't believe in the 13 principles of faith. We may ourselves come from families where our parents, our siblings, our children take a very different stance. Our brothers, our sisters, our cousins, our close friends take a very different stance when it comes to matters of faith to us. And it's definitely therefore not just an abstract question. What's the Jewish view on them? Are these people, chas v'shalom, heretics? Are they kofrim, apikosim? Does that mean that they are doomed to eternal hell? What exactly are we saying about these non-believers? That's one level in which it may hit close to home. It may even hit closer to home than that. It may be for us ourselves that on some occasions we all go to ups and downs in life, and there are moments perhaps when we get it and we're in the flow and we feel very closely connected to Hashem and to Yiddishkeit. And there may be other occasions when we're actually wobbling in our emunah and we're struggling and things are difficult, and either we're going through personal difficulties or we're going through philosophical difficulties and we're struggling with emunah, and through that struggle, we may still be faithfully trying to connect to community. We may be going to shiurim, we may be going to daven, because we appreciate that this is something exceptionally important to us. It's not something we want to break our connection with, and at the same time, we're struggling with our emunah and how to deal with it. So for us, again, also, this isn't just a question about those who are near to dear to us who may take different views to us. There may be questions about ourselves also and our own personal experiences, and we may wonder what exactly is Judaism's message to us. Is it telling us that this is all chas v'shalom a waste and purposeless, and if we struggle with one or other of the emunah, of the Ikri emunah, that makes us non-believers who are doomed to not being part of the Jewish people? What exactly is the claim of the Ikri emunah? So this is a very important question to ask, and one that I was therefore asked to address. Linked to this, but really...
That's just one other strand you didn't mention. Maybe it's obvious. It's not just those who don't believe in them, it's those who don't know them. There are probably the majority, sadly, of Jewry don't know them. It's not that they've read them and they disagree with them. That's quite a madrega to actually read them and disagree with them. But I think the majority just don't know them. What's their status? Sorry, I just wanted to add that as another...
No, please don't apologise. It's an important point. And it is a distinction that we will get to. For now, and when I'm saying people who don't believe them, you are correct. I'm blurring two categories. I'm talking about the person who knows them and has chosen not to believe in them, or finds themselves unable to believe in them, and the person who doesn't believe in them because they don't know about them at all. And I blurred them into one category of those who don't know them. But you are correct. This is one of the distinctions we're going to have to unpick. Is there a difference between someone who knows them and doesn't believe them, or someone who's just never even heard of them at all? And the question becomes even more significant when we're talking about non-Jews. How do non-Jews fit into all of this? Do non-Jews have to believe in them? And certainly when it comes to the non-Jewish world, what happens about non-Jewish world that has never heard of them? Most Jews, hopefully, at least know some of them, perhaps know that Judaism claims monotheism. But what happens if you are a pagan goat herd out in, I don't know much about Mongolia, but I'll use Outer Mongolia as our example. I assume in Outer Mongolia there are goat herds, who's never heard of the monotheistic faiths at all, has maybe never met a Muslim, a Jew, a Christian, is just keeping their ancestral religion, or perhaps a Native American 800 years back, and maybe never even come in contact with a monotheist. Avraham Avinu is just not a figure in their life at all. Not only doesn't belong to an Abrahamic faith, but never even heard of one of them. What about them? How do they fit into all of this? So the concept of Ikrim Emunah would seem to condemn probably 99% plus of humanity, or how does all of this fit into a fair and just world? I'd point out that even the monotheistic faiths maybe tick Ikrim Emunah 1 and 2. They believe in a God, one God. They may, if you're a Christian, you may begin having problems with the third one, that God has no body, and maybe even the second one, with that he's a complete unity. Exactly how the Trinity fits into this is difficult. If you're a Muslim, you're going to have problems with the truth of the Torah. Christians do accept the truth of what they call the Old Testament, or Tanakh. The Muslims don't. They believe the Torah itself is corrupted, and it's the Quran that carries the whole truth. So again, it's not an exaggeration to say that 99% of humanity are excluded from the Yud Gim and Ikrim, even if currently 50% plus are at least monotheists. So this is a massive topic. Now, before I go further, I just want to point out a couple of things. The first thing is in terms of the structure of what we're going to do this week, and at least starting the next week, we'll see how many weeks we focus on this topic, which is, I'm broadly speaking not going to look at the particular quibbles over details of one or the other of the Yud Gim and Ikrim. I'm very happy to do that as part of another series. We could work systematically through each one of the Ikrim Emunah and unpick what it means, what it's demanding of us to believe, why we should believe it, why it makes sense to believe, and so on and so forth. That's not the topic of this mini section of Shiurim. What I'm going to be doing is simply looking at what's the role of these 13 principles of faith. What happens if we ourselves are wobbling in them? What happens if our brothers, our sisters, our parents and children don't believe in them? What happens if we know someone who's never even heard of them, whether Jew or non-Jew? So we're looking at the broader topic of, to what degree is someone a heretic if they don't believe in them at all? That's the first point I want to make. That's the topic of this mini-series, though I recognize that we should probably, at some stage in our Sunday morning shiurim, look through each one of them with care and in detail and understand the specifics of the belief, but that's not the task I set myself for now. This is the first point to make. The second point to make is that we need to actually look at what the Rambam himself claims about them, and then we need to look at what the followers of the Rambam, those who have followed after the Rambam, subsequently to the Rambam, down to the modern age, have to say on the topic. So we're going to open up by looking at what the Rambam says, and then we'll look at what later thinkers have said around this issue of what exactly is the claim here about non-believers in this topic. So, firstly, where did the Rambam list the 13 principles of faith? Now, the Rambam wrote two major works. His halachic work is the Mishnah Torah, written in Hebrew, and his philosophical work is his Moreh Nevuchim, his Guide to the Perplexed, written in Arabic. In neither of these two works does he really list the 13 principles of faith. Fascinating. These are the two works that are really the greatest works of the Rambam, the most lengthy ones, the ones that he's most well known for. And in neither of them does he list them systematically. Now, I choose my words with care because I say he doesn't list them systematically. It doesn't mean to say he doesn't have the ideas behind them. He certainly does. Moreh Nevuchim is a philosophical work, and the whole of Moreh Nevuchim is really around matters of belief. And in fact, Moreh Nevuchim is his foremost answer to those who criticize him and disagree with the whole concept of principles of faith. Because the criticism of the Rambam, or one part of the criticism, is who said anything about faith and beliefs, and especially philosophical beliefs about God does have a body, doesn't, unified, not unified. Where does philosophy come into Judaism? Surely Judaism is a religion of action and deed and emotion and speech rather than philosophy. And Moreh Nevuchim, in many ways, is a sustained argument for the idea that Jews also have to have certain beliefs. Not only do they have to have certain beliefs, but these are central to what it means to be a Jew. And Moreh Nevuchim really argues that all the actions we do and all the mitzvahs around action and speech and emotion are to train and channel our minds to think in a certain way. But what really matters is how we think. What really matters is what we believe. What really matters is the degree to which we can know God. Now, how can we know God? Through our minds. How can we know that which is good and intrinsic and absolute? Through our minds. The Rambam, let's not forget our previous discussion, the Rambam's understanding of what we mean when we say the soul survives after death is that consciousness survives after death. Our minds survive after death. It's our abstract intelligence, our reasoning that remains after death. And it's mitzvahs are a method of making us think differently, making us have certain beliefs. And you can see that actually, to be fair to the Rambam, many of the mitzvahs of the Torah. The Torah says, why should you put tefillin on? Why should you have mezuzah? Why should you celebrate Pesach? Why should you sit in the sukkah? In order that you should remember certain things, that you should internalize God consciousness into your mind, that you should walk through life aware of Hashem in one's life and living with a connection to Him, which in the Rambam, this means a consciousness connection. The whole of religion is really, of Yiddishkeit, is consciousness forming. So the Moreh Nevuchim is a sustained defense, if you like, of this idea that certain beliefs are essential to what it means to be a frum Jew, a practicing Jew, and it's very Maimonidean to take that belief, because the Rambam is the one who argues that so much of Yiddishkeit is about what we believe. Fascinatingly, the Yudkim and Ikrim have been adopted across the Jewish world, and including the Kabbalistic world, including the world that very much doesn't think that Yiddishkeit is all about philosophy and is all about what we think. Probably the mainstream view in Judaism, which is that it's about action and it's about what one does, which one would have expected the conclusion of that to be, therefore, a non-acceptance of the view of the Rambam with his centrality of principles of faith, of matters of belief. Nonetheless, the view of the Rambam has been accepted. But certainly, according to the Rambam, who sees philosophy as so central, we understand why the Yudkim and Ikrim are there at this pinnacle of belief. Having said that, though, the Rambam does not list them in a systematic manner in the Moreh Nevuchim. Now, this is very strange. You would think if the Rambam took them as so central, what would be more important than to open, or perhaps close, your philosophical work with? And I'm now going to summarize everything I said with the 13 principles of faith. So it's interesting, the Moreh Nevuchim doesn't list them. What about his Mishnah Torah, his halachic work? Also doesn't list them systematically. Though again, they pretty much can be found scattered throughout Mishnah Torah. So in his halachas around the principles, he has a section of Mishnah Torah. The Mishnah Torah encompasses, Mishnah Torah is not like the Shulchan Aruch. It doesn't just include practical halacha for day-to-day life. It includes also halacha about how to bring sacrifices in the temple. It brings halachas which are of tum and tara, things which aren't relevant nowadays. And it also has a whole section around midas and character development, which the Shulchan Aruch doesn't really include. And also a whole section around teshuvah, repentance, which the Shulchan Aruch doesn't include. And also a section around fundamentals of belief and faith, which the Shulchan Aruch doesn't include, because the Rambam believes these are halachic matters. And he has therefore a section called Yesodei HaTorah, the principles of the Torah. And remarkably, in that section, he doesn't list all 13 principles of faith. He lists, if you like, the most principles, the most fundamental of the fundamentals. The theme of Yesod Torah is around belief in Hashem, so he definitely lists the principles around belief in Hashem, but not the other ones. We need to wait to, for example, Hilchos Teshuvah, for him to list some of the others. Hilchos Avodah Zarah, for him to list yet more of the others. So again, in his great halachic work, the Mishnah Torah, it is true one can go through it and pretty much collect all the 13 principles of faith. I say pretty much because there are differences in how he says them in the two works, in the place where he does list, which we'll come on to a few moments, the 13 principles of faith in the Mishnah Torah, but he doesn't anywhere in the Mishnah Torah list them. And again, we would have thought, had they been so central to the thinking of the Rambam, that somewhere in Mishnah Torah there'd be a halacha which says a Jew has to believe, and then he would have listed all 13 things that a Jew has to believe. So it's interesting that he doesn't. Where does he list them systematically? In a relatively less well-known work, less popular work, a very, very important work, probably his third most important work, his Perush Mishnayos, his commentary on the Mishnayos. That's where he lists the Yud Gimel Ikrim systematically, one by one. And he lists them and in his commentary to the Mishnayos as an introduction to the 10th or 11th Perek of Sanhedrin, known as Perek Chelek. The Perek is called Chelek because the topic is Chelek Ba'olam Haba, who has a portion in the world to come, who doesn't. So if the topic of these Mishnayos is who does and doesn't have a portion in the world to come, the Rambam there comments on these Mishnayos. In fact, he writes a lengthy introduction to this chapter of Mishnayos. And this introduction to the chapter of Mishnayos is where he lists his 13 principles of faith, because he wants to say that all 13 are ones that exclude one from a portion to the world to come. So that's the place where he systematically lists them. By the way, we've already, in this group here, we've already looked at this chapter, this work of the Rambam, when we spoke about Olam Haba. Because when I was telling you about Olam Haba, and in a subsequent share I was asked for references, and I listed a whole string of references, one of them was the introduction of the Rambam to the chapter of Chelek. Mishnah Torah, his Perush Mishnayos, his commentary on Mishnayos, by and large, is more or less a running commentary. However, on a few occasions, he steps out of the role of running commentator and writes lengthy pieces, which become almost mini works in their own rights, such as an introduction to Pirkei Avos, which is many, many times longer than Pirkei Avos itself, and becomes its own mini work called the Shmona Parakim, the 8 chapters, and his introduction to Chelek, to this Mishnah, this chapter of Mishnayos, which also really is its own mini work. And it is there that he speaks about rewards and punishment, the world to come. Is there, for example, just to remind you, the mashal I gave about a little school kid. At the beginning, you bribe a school kid to learn their spellings or their times table with sweets, and they get a bit older and you offer them a bike. A bit older and you tell them they need to do so to do well in their exams. A bit older, you tell them that they need to do so to get a job. But the real motivation is because you want education. You want them to be educated for itself, even if it's got nothing to do with sweets or a bike or a job or GCSEs. It's about the character-forming nature, the effect it has on them as people. So this Moshe of the Rambam is found there in his introduction to Chelek. That's one example of one of the things we quoted from him. And it's there that he lists the 13 principles of faith. Now, this has several implications. The first implication is that means that the fullest and most extant and systematic treatment of the 13 principles of faith we only have in Judeo-Arabic. And for those of us, I guess everyone here in the room who doesn't speak Judeo-Arabic, we can't access it in the original, we can only access it in the translation. And therefore always care needs to be taken when one can only access things in translation. The Mishnah Torah, which is the Hebrew work of the Rambam, he doesn't list it systematically. Mo Nevuchim, which is also written in Arabic, as I said, he doesn't list it systematically. The Perush Mishnayos, his commentaries Mishnayos, he does, but we only have it in translation, point number one. Point number two, as I say, it's interesting that he doesn't list it in a systematic manner elsewhere, and we need to address that. Point number three, in the non-systematic listing, we need to see if there are any differences. The Rambam in his commentary to Mishnayos at the end of the day was not writing, it wasn't his last word on the topic. It wasn't his primary halachic work, and it wasn't his primary philosophical work. It was a commentary to Mishnayos. Indeed, it was something the Rambam wrote when he was very young. He wrote it in his 30s, as opposed to his Mishnah Torah and his Mo Nevuchim, which he wrote much later in life. So it's not his last word on the subject, nor is it his primary halachic work on the subject. And despite both those limitations, it was the source and the wellspring from which the whole concept of 13 principles of faith and Yigdal and the Animamin catechism, the Animamin statements come from. The third point to mention is, and this is always important with the Rambam, is that the Rambam saw what he was doing as not completely an innovation, but he simply saw himself as drawing from earlier sources. So the Rambam isn't creating the 13 principles of faith out of the blue. He's not saying I've sat down and I've thought to myself, what do I think are 13 important things? He's saying if you go through Shas, all Mishnayos and all Gemaras, you will see that these are the 13 things listed. The Rambam was a great systemizer. That's where he saw his role as doing in the Mishnah Torah. If you want to derive halacha from Gemara, we all know how difficult it is. If you want to focus on any particular topic, let's say a Shaila in Hilchos Shabbos. Well, first of all, the Masechet that deals with Shabbat is very long. It's got, more than 100 pages. And it's not arranged in a particularly systematic order. So you certainly have to learn the Masechet of Shabbos. But then you're not finished, because there are other related tractates in the Talmud that deal with Shabbos also. You really have to know Maseches Beitzah, and Maseches Eruvin, and Maseches Yoma, and Maseches Merkot before you've gone anywhere. And even once you know all of those, there may be an odd Gemara somewhere in the middle of nowhere that deals with the Nisyan Hilchos Shabbos. So the Rambam saw his role as drawing out all these different sources. Because Gemara was written as something different. The structure of Gemara is a free-flow summary of conversations that took place in the Beis Medrash. And we all know when you're conversing in the Beis Medrash, you're discussing any Torah topic, people go off subjects, questions are asked, different issues are raised, there's an overlap. So someone's learning Hilchos Yom Tov and someone says, well, how does that compare to the halachas for Shabbos? And before you know it, you drift into a discussion around the laws of Shabbat and rather than Yom Tov. Or you can be learning something completely separate around brachas and it just reminds you of something. And that's how Gemara is structured. The Rambam saw his job as drawing all of this out to create common themes, which is what the listing of the 13 principles of faith are. So the Rambam doesn't think he's innovating anything. He says, I'm simply going through all the sources, the psukim in the Torah, the psukim in Nach, and Gemaras, and wherever I find evidence from these psukim that this is an essential belief in the Torah, I'm drawing this out for the 13 principles of faith. But he's writing this all as an introduction to the very Mishnayos which are ostensibly dedicated to discussing who does and doesn't have a source in the world, a place in the world to come. So it's fascinating that the Mishnayos which are listing them don't list the 13 principles of faith. The Rambam has to write an introduction because the Mishnayos miss some out. Which brings us really to the next point, which is in the same way as in the Rambam, there's only a systematic listing of 13 principles of faith in one place in his commentaries to the Mishnayos. And elsewhere he doesn't list them systematically. Fascinatingly, even in the Gemara, in the Talmud, and the Mishnah, there isn't a completely systematic listing of the 13 principles of faith. You would expect maybe a whole tractate of Gemara to dedicated to these things, but no. There's tractates Gemara dedicated to Shabbos and Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah and how to bring korbanos and damages and all sorts of important things, but not Ikrim Emunah. There's no chapter or section of Masechet Mishnah called Emunah. The Rambam has to draw it out. Okay, so this is the background of the complications around the matter. Why does the Rambam not list them systematically elsewhere? Why are they not found systematically in Mishnah and Gemara? And how do we compare what the Rambam does say elsewhere to what the Rambam says in his one systematic listing, which is Perish Mishnayos? We're swiftly running out of time, so I just want to make a couple of points clear. None of what I've said is in any way an attempt to minimize at all, not an iota, the importance of the 13 principles of faith. There's very good reasons, probably, why the Rambam doesn't list them systematically in the same way in his Monavach and Mishnah Torah, not least because there's something superficial and artificial about listing the 13 principles of faith. The Rambam himself, it makes sense how he lists them elsewhere. It makes sense that in the Mishnah Torah, he lists them in their correct halachic division. When you're dealing with the laws of idol worship, surely that's the logical place to list the fundamentals which are relevant to idol worship. When you're talking about belief in God, that's the logical place to list belief in God. When you're talking about prophecy, that's the logical place to list the 13 principles of faith around prophecy. The 13 principles of faith, in a sense, are like car stickers. They're a good catchphrase or slogan to quickly summarize complicated things. But the Mishnah Torah and the Monavuchim are more sophisticated works. They're more profound works. They're works which are trying at great length, 14 volumes of Mishnah Torah, 3 volumes of Monavuchim. These are massive works. It makes sense to deal in more detail with each of the 13 principles of faith, and therefore not to list them simply as a summary, but to deal with them and unpick them chapter after chapter after chapter and properly explore them. So I don't think anyone can argue that the Rambam radically shifted his viewpoint between his youth, when he was 30, and he wrote his commentary to the Mishnayos, and his older age, his middle age, when he wrote his greater works, his Guide to the Perplexed and his Mishnah Torah. I don't think there's any evidence of this whatsoever. Equally, I don't think the Rambam would have been bothered at all by the fact that the Mishnah and the Gemara don't list them systematically. The Rambam was aware that he was a systemizer. He was aware. It's the same in Hilchos Shabbos. It's the same in every area of halacha. The Rambam draws out the themes and the principles from the scattered references across Tanakh. So I don't think there's no big punchline over here in which I'm going to argue that the Rambam in his Moed Nevuchim and Mishnah Torah didn't agree with what he said about the 13 principles of faith. But, and with this but, we will finish the topic for today and resume next week. It is nonetheless important for us to look at how he says it in his final works, his Guide to the Perplexed, and more so perhaps his halachic work, because we're dealing ultimately with the bottom line. As much as it may be interesting to get into philosophy, we're dealing with what's the bottom line about what the Rambam would say. It's important to look at his Mishnah Torah and see exactly what he says there, to see whether exactly how he formulates these principles. So in brief, the summary is as follows. The concept of principles of faith, drawn out by the Rambam from earlier sources. The Rambam doesn't see himself as creating them, but simply discovering or uncovering or systemizing them. There's much argument around the concept and principle of the principles of faith. There's some argument about exactly what goes into them, but there's no doubt these have become formulative, absolutely basic to Judaism, and I'm not in the business of questioning them in this particular series. If we want, in a later series, we can go through them one by one and look at them in more detail. But it is important to notice that the most famous summaries of them, namely the Ani Maamin formula, namely Yigdal, are much later summaries that the Rambam never saw, never heard of, written much later, and they're summaries, and by definition, a summary loses nuance. Where the Rambam does write them as a list is in his commentary to Mishnayos, and there he writes them at great length. They're much longer than the poem of Yigdal or the Ani Maamin, which is why the poem of Yigdal and Ani Maamin was written as a summary. They're much longer than the full length. The full length treatment the Rambam gives them in his commentary to Mishnayos is much longer. In addition, he formulates them very differently in the commentary, in his halachic works and in his philosophical works, and we need to look at that with care to see how he formulates them. Finally, in concluding words, does any of this hit Shulchan Aruch? Because at the end of the day, we don't paskin like the Rambam in halacha. We paskin like Shulchan Aruch. The Rambam had all sorts of views about sukkahs and about shofars and about tefillin and about matters of belief. And in all of them, we need to turn to the text of the Shulchan Aruch to see what the Shulchan Aruch says on the matter. And the answer is the Shulchan Aruch does, to some extent, list these principles of faith. It does hit practical halacha also, but we'll need to look at next week to see in what way it hits practical halacha. And hopefully next week we'll begin unpicking what does this all mean to us in terms of ourselves and our own journeys in belief, and that of our families, that of those who are close to us, and of the wider world in general. So I'll stop there for today unless anyone has any questions. And please, well, next week we'll be able to take this a little bit further. Okay, I wish everyone a good day, and thank you as always so much for joining.
Thank you.
Yes, guys, thank you.